for a very important annual hearing to discuss the President's trade agenda. The laws that delegate Congress's constitutional trade authority to the executive also require close consultation with Congress. This hearing is an important part of that consultation, and it provides an opportunity to explain the President's ambitious trade agenda to the Congress and all Americans. Members of this committee are looking forward to this very important discussion. A critical component of the trade agenda that I'd like to discuss is US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA for short. Farmers, workers, businesses stand to benefit greatly from that agreement. More market access for agriculture, new commitments to critical areas such as customs, digital trade, intellectual property, labor, environment, currency, and the lowering of non-tariff barriers all translates into higher wages, greater productivity, and more jobs. In fact, the U.S. International Trade Commission's economic analysis found that USMCA will create 176,000 new jobs. We shouldn't squander this opportunity to update NAFTA, which is now a quarter of a century old, but has been critical to the success of farmers and businesses. Since NAFTA's implementation in 1994, our agricultural exports to these two countries have more than quadrupled. Corn exports increased sevenfold. A 2019 Business Roundtable study found that international trade supports 39 million jobs across America and 12 million jobs from trade with Mexico and Canada. I'm a family farmer, you know. I can tell you that NAFTA has been critical to the success of Iowa farmers and businesses. The same Business Roundtable study found that 130,000 Iowa jobs were supported by trade with Canada and Mexico in 2017, and $6.6 billion in Iowa goods and services were exported to Canada and Mexico the same year. According to the National Association of Manufacturers, Canada and Mexico purchased nearly half of Iowa's total manufacturing exports. President Trump and you, Ambassador Lighthizer, delivered a solid deal to enhance this critical relationship with our good neighbors. Now, Congress must act on implementing it. As Mr. Lighthizer said earlier this year, doing so will enhance the credibility of our global trade agenda, and it provides some much-needed certainty to American farmers and businesses. For agriculture, international trade is critical to reaching the 95% of the world's consumers living outside the United States. In Iowa, we export every third row of soybeans. This is why I strongly support the administration's plan to pursue new trade deals with Japan, particularly the European Union, and even the United Kingdom when it is ready. So we should move quickly. Japan and the EU haven't been sitting still. They've been closing trade deals with other countries over the last 2 years. As a result, our farmers and businesses are losing market share to competitors with preferential access. We need to secure strong agreements so that we can restore a level playing field. And in order to get a deal with the United States, the EU has to include and negotiate agriculture. I've said this before, any deal with the EU that doesn't include agriculture will not get through the United States Congress. President Trump has rightly pointed out that trade must be fairer for workers, and this is central to his commitment to confront China in unfair trade practices and their mercantilist policies. When American companies get access to China's market, they often have to sacrifice valuable intellectual property or enter joint ventures with Chinese companies. China's massive subsidies also create global distortions. This has to stop. And President Xi must recognize that making these changes are in China's best interests as well. I applaud President Trump for confronting China decisively, and I urge him and President Xi to reach a deal that results in structural changes to China's discriminatory policy and practices and the elimination of the 301 tariffs. Ambassador Lighthizer, I share the administration's desire to ensure that hard work and innovation are rewarded, while unfair trade practices and illegal government subsidies are punished and ought to be punished. I agree that we must have strong and enforceable trade agreements. I believe that you're right to seek reforms at the World Trade Organization, and I share your views that strong and effective enforcement of the U.S. trade laws prevent other countries from taking advantage of us. But I don't agree that tariffs should be the tool we use in every instance to achieve every trade policy goal. I fear that continuing to use tariffs in this way will undermine our credibility with our current and potential trading partners and actually undo the benefits of our historic tax reform. Since March 2018, U.S. Customs and Border Protections have assessed over $15 billion in Section 301 tariffs and over $6.5 billion in Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. So, to be clear, American importers and consumers are paying for these tariffs. $22 billion out of the pockets of hardworking Americans is not in our national interest. I urge the administration to do everything it can to use tariffs as a last resort option and to maintain timely and efficient exclusion processes for those that are already in effect. And Ambassador, I want to thank you on that note for your commitment to instituting an exclusion process for Section 301 tariffs on imports from China. Before leaving the issue of tariffs, I want to highlight an example of successful alternative option. Specifically, Ambassador Lighthizer's team deserves a lot of credit for recently winning two very large WTO cases against China's distortive agricultural policies. While I support the administration's efforts to reform the WTO, we should continue to use WTO mechanisms that can hold China and others accountable to the greatest possible extent. So, closing, I'm glad to have you here today. Ambassador, I want to recognize the critically important and difficult task before you. Congress and the administration must work together to ensure that our trade policies benefit all Americans and encourage you to work with us to make that happen. As chairman, I pledge my support to the President's agenda, starting with the implementation of the USMCA. Senator White.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me begin, Mr. Chairman, by saying I very much share your view with respect to consultation with this committee. That was actually embedded in the law. Consultation, and more transparency was actually embedded in the law in 2015. So I want to make it clear I share the chairman's view on that point. The committee meets this morning to discuss the administration's trade agenda. First, China. The president likes to say, and I quote here, "Trade wars are good and they're easy to win. The situation on the battlefield says otherwise. China's market is now more closed off to American goods and American agriculture than before the trade war began. The president's next escalation will directly raise the cost of everyday goods in America, and the president is signaling that he'll betray our national security and let Huawei off the hook if China helps him save face." Now, there's no question that confronting the Chinese trade ripoffs was long overdue. The Chinese government and state-owned enterprises have gotten away with strong-arming American businesses, stealing our intellectual property, and undercutting American jobs for way too long. It has to be handled differently. Rather than chaos, what's needed is a well-coordinated international effort led by the United States to crack down on the Chinese abuses. Instead, the president has driven away our allies and it's not clear there's a discernible strategy to go forward. Now, some have attempted to focus our efforts directly where China is coming after our strength: highly technical manufacturing and innovation. The Ambassador Lighthizer, deserves credit for laying out this type of approach to the committee in the past. Unfortunately, those plans get knocked off course all too often by hailstorms of tweets sent while the president is watching television in the morning. As a result of this mismanagement on trade, the American people are faced with the prospect that everyday life in our country will be more expensive and less secure. The next round of tariffs the president is considering would drive up the cost of consumer goods sitting on shelves around the nation by as much as 25%. Millions and millions of American families are going to begin back-to-school shopping in a matter of weeks. School uniforms, gym clothes, sneakers, book bags, pencils, notebooks, you name it. With new tariffs in place, Mom and Dad might discover what they budgeted only goes 80% as far as they expected. And then there's the issue of Huawei. Huawei poses a genuine spying risk to the United States and our allies, allowing its equipment to be used in our telecommunications infrastructure would compromise our security. That's the opinion of national security experts outside the government and in key federal agencies. Even the president seemed to get it. At a recent White House event, he said of Huawei, and I quote, "You look at what they've done from a national security standpoint, from a military standpoint, it's very dangerous." But in the president's next sentence, he said, and I quote, "It's possible that Huawei even would be included in some kind of a trade deal." So basically, right out in the open, we've got members of the Intelligence Committee here, right out in the open, the president is telling China's spy masters that he's willing to give away America's national security for a face-saving trade deal. This isn't an academic concern, it's a real threat. But rather than holding our national security interests paramount, the president seems most interested in the splashy trade headlines. I'm going to close with a couple of quick comments about the Western Hemisphere. I've long said that NAFTA was a product of a different economic era, and it's time for an overhaul. The president campaigned on ripping up existing trade deals, but the new NAFTA sure resembles the old one. That said, there are areas of meaningful progress. It goes further than before on digital trade and state-owned enterprises. It takes a modernized approach to customs and duty evasion. And again, I'd like to commend Ambassador Lighthizer for obtaining some strong outcomes in the labor and environmental chapters. Yet when it comes to trade enforcement, the enforcement of our trade laws, there is sure some heavy lifting left to be done. Commitments from other countries aren't any good if there's no way of holding those countries to them. The new NAFTA retains a weak enforcement system from the old NAFTA, which too often gave a free ride to the trade chiefs. That's a bad deal for our workers, particularly the enforcement of labor obligations. Now, Senator Brown, our colleague from Ohio, and I have offered some solutions. I'm hopeful and optimistic that with some bipartisan work and that kind of blueprint, those are issues that can be resolved. In the meantime, there is no way to justify pulling out of the current NAFTA, since doing so would accomplish nothing except economic pain here at home. So I look forward to discussing these issues and more with the ambassador this morning. I thank him for joining the committee, and this is an important hearing, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your scheduling it.
Thank you. We have the pleasure of having Ambassador Lighthizer with us, sworn in as the 18th United States Trade Representative, May the 15th, 2 years ago. Members of this committee have gotten to know Bob well over the past couple years. I've had an opportunity to know him for at least 39 years, And because we have a lot to talk about today, I'm going to dispense with all your credentials. So please proceed with your conversation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wyden and members of the committee, it's a pleasure to appear before you today to testify on the President's trade agenda and the newly renegotiated United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. I should note before continuing that there are some parts of Senator Wyden's comments that I don't entirely endorse, but I do entirely endorse Senator Wyden. So I would like to begin by noting that the United States economy has added 5.8 million jobs since 2016 election. Notably, nearly 500,000 have been manufacturing jobs. The real GDP rose at an annual rate of 3.1% in the first quarter of 2019. The past 4 quarters have seen the fastest growth rate in GDP since 2015. The unemployment rate at 3.6% is the lowest rate in nearly a half a century and has been at or below 4% for 15 consecutive months. Wages are up. Hourly wages were up some 3.1% over the last 12 months. I commend this report right here to the committee. It's the Trade Policy Agenda and the 2018 Annual Report to the committee. It's the subject of this, one of the subjects of these hearings. The document which USTR put out recently outlines the administration's trade priorities and catalogs recent accomplishments. As most of you know, the President is troubled by huge and persistent trade deficits, which the United States has with many countries. These deficits are the result of many factors: faster economic growth, currency valuations, and to some extent tax policy, but they are also partially the result of trade rules that oftentimes are unfair and lock in non-economic advantages for our trading partners. We at USTR are very much focused on changing these rules where they are unfair to American farmers, ranchers, workers, and businesses. This has included renegotiating KORUS, of which you're aware, NAFTA, which we have just discussed and will discuss further. We also have been reviewing GSP eligibility, actively engaging in TIFA talks with many, many countries, and we can talk about that, and reviewing the rules and functions of the WTO. USTR has also been active in enforcing the existing obligations of our trading partners. We've brought many WTO cases. We've filed counter-notifications to the WTO and worked with other WTO members on a proposal to improve compliance with the existing WTO notification obligations. We are also engaged directly with trading partners under existing agreements. For example, we have successfully resolved concerns with Peru after requesting the first ever environmental consultations in the U.S.-Peru Trade Promotion Agreement. In addition, we have used Section 301 to investigate unfair trade practices in China. We believe our economic relationship with China has been unbalanced and grossly unfair to American workers, farmers, ranchers, and businesses for decades. As many members know, after an exhaustive process, we put tariffs on certain Chinese products and are preparing to do more if certain issues cannot be resolved satisfactorily. Finally, I am pleased to be able to testify here today on the newly renegotiated USMCA. We have worked very closely with members throughout this process, and many of the improvements in this agreement reflect Republican and Democratic members' ideas and thoughts. In short, I believe the USMCA is the strongest, most momentous trade agreement in U.S. history. It is the gold standard for rules on the digital economy, financial services, intellectual property, etc. It will help stop the outflow of manufacturing jobs and return many to the United States. Its labor and environmental provisions are the most far-reaching ever in a trade agreement. The agricultural chapter will lead to increased market access and eliminate unfair trading practices by our trading partners. This is a truly great agreement, and I look forward to working with members to make it even better and to write implementing legislation which will earn large bipartisan support. And that's my objective. I said it from the beginning. My objective was to get a very large number of Democrats and Republicans to support this. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will stop. Thank you again for the courtesy you and the other members have shown towards me during this 2+ years as USTR, and I look forward to your questions.
Yeah. Before my 5 minutes starts, and I thank you for your opening statement, I'd like to take a minute to briefly touch on something of great importance to the ranking member and me. Congressional support is key to a successful trade policy agenda. To further this support, we need to have a good grasp on what the administration is doing. This means members, as well as our staffs, receiving timely information, including negotiating proposals and texts to allow us to support the administration in discussions with our trading partners. In short, the U.S. Constitution calls on a strong partnership between Congress and the administration on trade policy, and I hope that we can strengthen the partnership and further our trade agenda going forward with a consistent two-way dialogue.
Mr. Chairman, without imposing on your time, not only are you right, it is embedded in the 2015 new requirements, and I agree completely.
Okay. Now my time starts. As I stressed in my opening statement, congressional implementation of Mexico-Canada agreement will provide some much-needed certainty, and consequently, certainty is important for our farmers and businesses. We can't afford delay. When Congress implements a trade agreement, it becomes U.S. law, giving Americans and our trading agreement partners certainty in relationships and the benefits that come with it. This means not having to question whether this relationship or associated benefits will be threatened or jeopardized as a means to an unrelated end. So my question, what assurances can you provide us that implementation of the USMCA will deliver that certainty that Congress, Americans, and our trading partners expect from bringing the agreement into U.S. law?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you say, that people enter into trade negotiations to get that certainty, largely for their businesses and for their farmers. From the United States point of view, we have negotiated very closely with both parties. We have covered all of these items. People have made concessions. We have what is now an enforceable agreement, significantly more enforceable than past agreements. And I expect to work with the members of the committee to make it even more enforceable. So the certainty one can get is that Mexico and Canada, as far as we're concerned, have to live up to the actual letter of the agreement. I think they understand that, and we certainly expect to do the same thing.
You've indicated using Section 301 to enforce labor and environment commitments under USMCA. I want to assure that all USMCA commitments will be enforceable and through methods that don't raise taxes on Americans. Could you please identify other ways that we can ensure that USMCA will deliver the benefits that are promising Americans throughout all chapters of the USMCA?
So let me say, first of all, the agreement is completely enforceable. We have a process of panel decisions like you have in most trade agreements. The USMCA and NAFTA before it had a provision that said in certain circumstances a country can opt out of the panel decision if they want to. We did not change that. We left that in place. Largely because we didn't want to be in a position where someone could challenge U.S. trade laws. That is something that some members support and some other members are critical of. But it's our view you can still. We expect 99% of the time you're going to end up, maybe even 100% of the time, you're going to end up with panel discussions and panel decisions the same way we have had them in the past and can have them going forward. It certainly isn't the United States position that we would block panels, and I think it's clear that the Mexicans and the Canadians feel the same way. So there are a series of of dispute settlement processes, but also what we did in this agreement, which I think is far more helpful, is we made the obligations very, very specific. The more general the obligations are, the harder they are really to enforce. So if you take, for example, the annex on labor in Mexico, it is very precise about what Mexico has to do. And Mexico did follow that in their own law when they implemented their labor law. So I would say, number one, we have a viable dispute settlement process, one that I'm willing to work with members on, and will follow the basic instincts of members to the extent to which they want to plus it up, because there's room to do that, and I'm certainly happy to do that. Secondly, we were far more specific than a lot of these agreements in the past, so that we can precisely say whether or not someone is following it. So I'm comfortable that we will get the benefits of this agreement, and I certainly endorse your suggestion. People talk about 180,000 jobs. If you look at the top of the ITC number, and in their text they said there's reason to believe we would be close to the top. Close to the top, it's 1% of GDP and 550,000 jobs. So there really never has been a trade agreement that's had this much impact, has the potential for this much impact on the economy, on workers, just right across the economy.
Senator White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, welcome again. And the next round of trade war tariffs could come soon. And I talked earlier about the impact on families shopping for school and school equipment, but I want to ask you about college students now, because they're going to be out buying laptops and smartphones and tablets, as well as books and shoes and other essentials. A lot of these college students are already up to their eyeballs in debt. And it seems to me the next round of the trade war tariffs may require college students to borrow even more to pay for the Trump trade war. Now, these college students can't make it very easily to Washington, D.C. They don't have the wherewithal to make these trips. So start, if you would, by telling me how you're taking into account these kinds of widespread impacts on the general public, such as students, college students I just asked about, whose comments may not be reflected in the public comments that you've asked for.
Thank you, Senator, for that comment. First of all, I would just note that in terms of the last tranche, we have hearings going on right now. We have some 300. They started yesterday. We have some 325 witnesses, and we've had more than 2,000 submissions. And so we're in the process of going through that. And I certainly don't want to prejudge all of that. But we have our professional staff going, and then ultimately the political staff will look at that. And in this last tranche, as you say, there are issues. There are products like cell phones and laptops, which have been avoided until now. I would take a step back, because when you refer to it as the Trump trade war, I would say that as you and I have spoken many times, none of this makes any sense unless you think we have a problem with China stealing our intellectual property. And I would say to those college students, if China steals your intellectual property, you're not going to have jobs in the future. And much worse, your children are not going to have jobs in the future. So to me, the first question we have to establish is China a problem? Is a $450 billion trade deficit with China a problem? If you think not, then none of this makes any sense. If you think it does, then you have to do it as cleverly as you can, I would confess. And it's not easy. If you think China's not stealing our intellectual property, then we shouldn't do this. If you think they're not forcing technology transfer, you shouldn't do this. If you think they're not grossly subsidizing and taking over our markets, then we shouldn't do these things. But to us, we believe that's the case. We think we had an untenable situation with China, one that should have been addressed, frankly, a couple of decades ago. It's a long history of them violating the norms of intellectual property and similar norms, moving forward and making promises and not keeping the promises. So we're in a position where we view ourselves as having the most serious problem you can face in the trade space. with nothing less than the jobs of our children on the line. And if you face that, then there are going to be issues. Now, it's fair for you to say,
Mr. Ambassador, because time is short, I don't take a backseat to anybody in terms of fighting China cheating. The question is how you do it. Let me get my next question in if I could. With respect to the Western Hemisphere, Mexico changed its labor laws. That was a good thing. But the key, obviously, is enforcement. And as you know, Senator Brown and I developed a framework that we believe can finally get us enforcement with real teeth. It provides resources, technical assistance, and basically it's a cooperative effort to fight against losing out on real enforcement. And I want to get this right. You and I have talked about it. We want to do it on labor. We want to do it on environment and enforcement more broadly. It's been more than 6 months since the president signed the agreement. But the bottom line is the heavy lifting on enforcement is still ahead. So my question to you is, for those of us that really want to see a new day in terms of tough trade enforcement, will you commit to working with members of Congress to do whatever it takes, and I want to emphasize, whatever it takes to address these core concerns so that we can say, we turn the page, and now finally we have trade enforcement with teeth in it?
Yes.
All right. I'll quit while I'm ahead. I want to emphasize, colleagues, I said whatever it takes to get that new day. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stabenow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and welcome, Ambassador Lighthizer. Let me first say, and I want to speak specifically first on the new NAFTA, however we call it. There's a lot of work that's been done, but we're not there yet, and specifically on enforcement and labor and the environment, and also the access to medicines and the cost of medicine that I want to ask you about. But I want to just reinforce and hope that you're very serious in response to our ranking member's question and working with everyone moving forward to be able to fix the things that they're concerns about, specifically Senator Wyden and Senator Brown's efforts around enforcement, which I think are very important and are put forward as a good faith effort to be able to finally do something beyond just language, but to actually have enforcement. I want to ask you, though, specifically about another provision that's not been focused on as much, and that is provision that relates to the pharmaceutical industry, because I'm very concerned that while we're debating lowering the cost of prescription drugs, and the President has talked about that, there's an effort going on in this committee and in the House. We know that the cost of medicine has skyrocketed. We pay far more than others around the world for prescription drugs. What I'm worried about is in the middle of this negotiation, and this is deja vu all over again. We've got a situation where, like Medicare Part D negotiations, which were meant to bring down prices, the pharmaceutical industry used their heft to be able to put a ban on negotiation in the middle of that bill. And so now in the middle of this effort, we see the brand name drug companies, one of the biggest vocal supporters of this agreement, and then we look more closely and we see what I certainly view as a giveaway to the drug companies in the middle of this agreement. These provisions stop competitors from getting cheaper generic drugs onto the market. I've seen the argument about how this language is supposed to reduce so-called foreign freeloaders from other countries. In other words, other countries that have a patent that is less supposedly freeloading off of us. But I would say in Canada, where they have an 8-year timeline rather than the 10-year in this bill, the cost of their medicine is about 40% less than ours for the same medication. So I think if in order to protect the industry, we're actually making it harder and higher costs in Canada, that's not in the best interests of Americans that want very much to have the opportunity to lower prices and have more generic competition. So is any of the language in this bill going to get us to a point of lower prices, number one? And secondly, are you planning to request the same language as part of your negotiations with the European Union, Japan, the UK? Are we going to see this effort going on all over the world to protect the patents and the prices for these drug companies?
So thank you, Senator. I think that's a really excellent question. So let me take a step back and say, so where are we? Since the beginning of our having trade negotiations, one of our objectives has been to have other countries adopt, I may have to run over just a second, Mr. Chairman, have other countries adopt our intellectual property laws. That's been the objective in every fast track or trade promotion authority. It goes back to at least 1888 when the United States joined the Paris Convention. This has been our objective. It's a negotiating objective that this Congress passed when they set it out for us. So what we do then is we go around and we try to have other countries adopt our rules. In Obamacare, the Congress passed a 12-year data protection for biologics, right? 12 years. That's what you passed. That's what was signed into law, and that's what we have in the United States. What we went out and said, okay, we should have the same standards like we do in everything else, right? That's what we do. That's what our objective is. That's what the Congress told us to do. What we compromised on was 10 years, okay? So what we have in here is 10 years. It's 2 years less in the United States. And this is really an important point, Senator. There are no provisions in this agreement that will change U.S. laws with respect to pharmaceutical companies.
But
there are no ways.
But let me, excuse me, but just in the interest of time, let me say, you're saying it won't change it, but it also will stop us from changing in the future. You're putting into a trade agreement, and I can't imagine this won't be used as a reason coming back to say that we can't address lowering prices. We've had a lot of discussion in this committee, Judiciary Committee, important discussions about patent law and what is happening and reforms that need to be made, and you're locking in something that I believe is going to stop us from doing what could be done to lower prices.
So on that point, I completely agree with you. What we did is follow our law. We didn't change U.S. law at all, and to the extent a member thinks anything in here will stop you or slow you up from changing laws, these laws, then we have to correct that. I don't believe it does, but I will correct it in a way that you, Senator, say you've corrected that problem. We cannot be in a position where if the United States Congress decides on changing these rules in some way because you think it's good for get prices down, or for any other reason, if you change those, we should not be in a position where that's more difficult or precluded by this agreement.
Senator Corner.
I completely agree with you, and I think I have to satisfy you on that point, and I believe I will. So,
Mr. Ambassador, how are your negotiations going with the House and the Speaker and, on the USMCA, and when do you expect the administration will send us that agreement to begin voting on?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Senator. I've dealt as members here now. I have dealt from the beginning with Democrats as much as Republicans, and I have dealt with the leadership in the Congress consistently during the course of this, and before, but during the course of this Congress. And the Speaker has been completely fair and above board, and I think constructive in the way we've done it. She's put together a group of people. My point was, I know that generally what people want, and I know what we can do. I just need to get somebody that can sit down there and on the other side that'll say, yes, this is enough. And that's precisely what it is. And the Speaker is sympathetic to that, and she has facilitated that, and I think we're making progress in that, and my hope is that over the course of the next couple of weeks we can make substantial progress. So I believe we're on track. I think we're making progress, and I'm hopeful on that score. And the Speaker has been absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, exactly as you would hope she would be.
Well, I'm optimistic that we'll be able to vote on that both in the House and the Senate and get it done and behind us. I think that would provide a lot of reassurance to the U.S. economy, and I think it would be something very much in our national interest. Thinking about China now, I know the administration's position, and I think our conversations privately about TPP and multilateral trade agreements. You and the President have both indicated your preference for unilateral agreements. But as I think about the challenge of China, it seems to me that we need our friends and allies to work with us to counter China and to get China in a better place. I frankly am going to be amazed if you're able to get them to make structural changes. I hope you are. But obviously their biggest concern as an authoritarian country is about maintaining power. And their economy seems to be slipping, and some of the supply chain moving out of China into other countries like Taiwan and Vietnam. And I have to think they must be a little bit concerned about that and want some resolution. But can you tell me whether you think it's appropriate at some point to revisit the TPP as a way to counterbalance China? They're certainly such a large country with such a large population. It seems to me that we would do better working with our friends and allies than in a unilateral agreement.
Thank you, Senator. I would say, first of all, I certainly agree that we're better off working with our allies, and we have a group we call the Trilateral Group, which is my counterparts in Japan and Europe, as well as the United States. The three of us get together. We've had 8 meetings already. We put out communiques, and we work together very closely on exactly this notion, on exactly this problem. And the whole purpose of it is to figure out rules and the like to coordinate with respect to dealing with China. So that is something that's going on. I totally agree with you. I don't know quite why we don't get the attention for this group. It gets attention when we have the meeting, and then everybody sort of says, you're not dealing with your allies. And the fact is, I deal with my allies very closely on this. And there also are state-owned enterprises and non-market economy provisions in the USMCA for the first time, serious provisions in there to deal with this issue of China. So I think we're doing a lot with our allies. So that's number one. Number two, on the issue of the TPP, you've heard me say before, number one, I think it's a bad agreement. You literally could have a car that was made 45% in Vietnam and 55% in China, sold in the United States with no duties. It would qualify. To me, it would be crazy. And that's just an example. It'd be the end of a lot of our manufacturing. I think it was a very bad agreement. It didn't deal with currency properly. It didn't deal with a lot of things. I think it was a mistake. I also don't buy the idea that we were going to somehow encircle China in this what would have been a 12-person group if we had joined it, because China would have joined it. So it would have been like the WTO. So that the geopolitical logic didn't make any sense. It was not a good agreement. And then the final thing I like to say is, really, there's 11 countries in this group. We have FTAs right now, which we'll modernize more, but we have FTAs with 6 of them. That leaves just 5. Of the 5 that are not covered, 95% of the GDP is Japan. And we're trying to do a deal with Japan. With respect to the others, the next biggest ones are like Vietnam, which has $300 billion worth of GDP as opposed to $5 trillion in Japan. Now, you could say, should you make a deal with these other ones? And the answer is probably yes, and we probably will get to that. But I don't think it matters, for example, whether we do a deal with Brunei or places like that. So I think the president's strategy of dealing individually with these people is a far better approach, and it's one that leaves you the flexibility of being able to, number one, keep China out of that agreement, and number two, enforce it with respect to that country. So I like where we are, and I think joining the TPP would be a mistake.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually want to agree with my colleague from Texas on this one point, in the notion that I want to ask you about weed, I want to ask you about intellectual property, I want to ask you about enforcement, but I will say that my colleague is pointing out when you can get everybody else to join you and a rejoinder on something like intellectual property, that could be very helpful to us. And so I think I wish we would, I hope we can do more of that. if I could, Washington is one of the most trade-dependent states in the nation. I think we have $77 billion in exports in 2017, and we help support over 300,000 jobs in and outside of our state for trade. So very important, and appreciate your hard work on all of this. My colleagues have brought up the enforcement issue. We worked on getting money into the customs bill to do more trade enforcement. So what do we have to do? I support my colleagues, Senator Wyden and Brown. What do we have to do to get you more support to build robust capacity with Mexico as it relates to enforcement?
So thank you, Senator. First of all, yeah, we appreciate the budget, the $15 million that you are such an important part of for us. I would say we're going to spend a fair amount of money that we don't necessarily have budgeted on exclusions. So at some point we had to talk about that. The exclusions are going to cost me a lot of money. But it's something the members want. It's something that I think we have to do in any event. I think in the area of enforcement generally, there I would make 2 points. One, we've brought more cases and have had more brought against us. In fairness, we've had more litigation at the WTO than anyone. And we've won some major cases, as has been pointed out, including by the chairman in these two very, very big cases with China. So we are very, very enforcement-oriented. Also, I would say I brought the only case that's been brought under the Peru environmental logging agreements. I mean, I brought a case there. We got a good result in that. So number one, we need the money. Hopefully we use it judiciously. I think we do. Two, we enforce across the board. And three, we have to come to agreement with members on plussing up USMCA and the enforcement side, particularly with respect, I would say, to labor and environment. And I'm happy to do that. These agreements are best not only when they have substantial bipartisan support, but also when they have substantial individual member buy-in, right? When members actually participate in the process. There has been, as I alluded in my opening statement, a lot of member participation during the course of the negotiation. I dealt with the ranking member a lot on that, and I'm sure he'll acknowledge that. And there's a lot of provisions in there that are there with I don't want to go across.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I think the success of the $15 million should bolster us to want to do more. And I believe there's so much outside our markets, outside the U.S. as markets, we need to support more activities. I wanted to ask you, obviously, with the region moving ahead on a comprehensive, progressive, trans-Pacific partnership, Japan doing a deal with the Canadian and Australian market puts us at a disadvantage. So how are we going to level the playing field there? And I do want to point out that protecting intellectual property is a bipartisan issue, that we firmly believe that China needs to do better on this, that we have to work harder on this. We appreciate the work that's being done on cloud computing. As I said, I would wish that there would be a world rejoinder on this. I think the United States has done best when we have a really bright message that everybody supports around the globe to put pressure on China, but maybe you can update us on what's happening with that.
Number one, the TPP is being implemented. It's in that process. The biggest single issue that's troubling to me on that front, in the short run particularly, is the hit to our farmers, because we're in a position where the Japanese have made agreements with TPP, and you articulated, you're right, as Canada and Australia and probably New Zealand would be the two biggest farm people that would affect us. They also made an agreement with Europe, which gave away additional farm agricultural access to Japan. We're in a position, thus, where we're treated worse than we were before relative to our strongest competition, and that's an unacceptable situation from the United States point of view, and we are in negotiations, and I think we're making headway in that score. So I don't want to say much more than that, but I'm happy to sit down and go through the details with you privately.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just, Ambassador, start with an example that confirms your consultation with us and results. I had brought up with you the TPA provisions that deal with good governance and transparency, anti-corruption. And I want to congratulate you on Chapter 27 of the USMCA and Chapter 28, which is patterned after the negotiations we made in TPP on good governance. Just very pleased that we had separate chapters in this agreement dealing with good governance and transparency. And I would just urge you to use this model in any future FTA that we have to make sure that you are complying with the principal trade objectives that we had in good governance. So thank you. That's an example of consultation with us, and I just appreciate that.
Could I just briefly say thank you for your leadership in this? You brought this up at my confirmation hearing. You brought it up at the meeting before the confirmation hearing, and you've brought it up many times for you. This idea of, transparency, good governance, anti-corruption, best regulatory practices, this is a very, very important part of this agreement, and I believe as long as we're here, of every agreement. And it's something that will be enforced as we move forward. So I appreciate your leadership on that, Senator.
Secondly, I want to thank you for opening markets in regards to the poultry industry. Delmarva is a principal poultry community with Senator Carper and Senator Warner and myself. The provisions here on opening markets, Maryland, the chicken industry is $1 billion in 2017, and Maryland's ninth in the broiler chickens. We're looking forward to the provisions of the USMCA as opening up additional opportunities for our poultry industry here in our state. So I also want to thank you in regards to that issue. So let me just underscore the point that Senator Wyden made in regards to enforcement. Yes, we are pleased to see Mexico change their labor laws and moving towards environmental changes. Our observations is that they don't really have the capacity to make this a reality without additional support from the United States. And that's why we look at the Wyden-Brown effort as an effort to make sure that we have meaningful enforcement. So as you have set up with Speaker Pelosi a mechanism to deal with the concerns that have been expressed by members of the House, recognize that for those of us who really want to support the USMCA, this issue of enforcement is a major issue that needs to be dealt with as we move forward on this process.
Well, thank you, Senator. First of all, I appreciate your comments on poultry, and I completely agree with this point. We have to make an effort on capacity building with respect to Mexico. Canada is also, I should say, has announced that they're going to do capacity building there. What I think that Mexico does not get enough credit for what they actually did. There's very few examples in history of a country doing what they did, the kind of labor reform. It's really quite amazing when you look at it. An example of which is that they've agreed to have secret ballot votes on their collective bargaining agreements, of which they have 700,000. And that's going to take a period of time to do that, but that's an amazing commitment by Mexico, and it's something that we all have a stake in, all of us, in that seeing, number one, we will have enforceable provisions to make sure they do it, and that's what members want, and we'll work on plussing those up. And number two, I think you're completely right. We have to have provisions in here where we build, we help them build their capacity to do it. I certainly have no interest, I know the President doesn't, of doing this, entering into this agreement, which we consider to be historic, and having it just peter out in non-enforcement in years, in the future years when we're not here anymore. So I completely agree with that. I view it as part of our legacy to actually be in a position that this will go on as automatic as enforcement. Having said that, enforcement, as I've said before, enforcement is about people, right? If you had a bad cop on your street, your laws aren't going to be enforced. So, but I certainly
and recognize that this is the most recent trade agreement we'll enter into. It will be used as the model for the next. So therefore, the fact that we have the governance provisions in this agreement will help us, whether it's Japan or EU or Vietnam, that we need to make sure we also have the provisions in regards to enforcement and capacity to enforce as we look at the next country that we will be looking at for an FTA.
Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to echo the comments of the ranking member on the USMCA. We need to have stronger enforcement across the board, particularly on labor and the environment, and I hope we can get there at the end of the day, at least to get this member's support. But I'd like to move to another question. At the beginning of the month, Americans watched as the president fabricated a diplomatic standoff with Mexico and then reached an agreement that is a slightly modified version of the status quo. If this is the best win the president can get, then he's right about one thing. I'm tired of winning. For an entire week, we had the president throw a high-stakes temper tantrum, put tens of thousands of jobs at risk by threatening tariffs that would raise costs for American consumers and businesses. And I think, Ambassador, you and I both know that tariffs are just a tool. They can be the right tool in some cases, but they definitely can be the wrong one in many cases. And in my mind, imposing tariffs on Mexico because the president felt they weren't doing enough on immigration clearly would be wrong. So I'm trying to understand where we draw the line here. Do you believe it was appropriate for the president to threaten tariffs on Americans because he doesn't believe Mexico was doing enough on immigration? I'm sorry, can you put your microphone on?
I'm sorry. I'll repeat, absolutely.
Absolutely.
As you know, this is not my area. I don't get into immigration. That's another department.
But you do deal with tariffs.
I sit here worried about no, but I do. In some cases, I deal with tariffs. But I think from the president's point of view, he had a crisis. It was a crisis. It was building at a very fast pace. Something had to be done. Mexico was not agreeing to do what needed to be done. I think that.
So you believe that absolutely the use of tariffs for a non-trade issue is an appropriate use?
I think if you get to the point where you think it's a national crisis, a national security problem, you do what you have to do. Absolutely, and I would suggest any member would do that.
Let me ask you this: would it be appropriate for the president to threaten tariffs on NATO countries if they think they aren't spending enough on defense? If they think that he thinks that's a national security challenge?
Well, I mean that's up to the president to decide. I haven't given that 5 seconds worth of thought.
Would it be appropriate to threaten tariffs on a country that hasn't pulled out of the Iran deal?
I haven't given that 5 seconds worth of thought.
You know, would it be appropriate for the president to threaten tariffs if he feels the country isn't doing enough to block Huawei from their markets?
I haven't given that 5 seconds.
Well, I know you haven't given it 5 seconds, but here's the point. We need to know what is the line in which tariffs, which affect markets as well as American jobs, because tariffs at the end of the day are taxes. And they're not taxes paid by the country. They're taxes paid by American consumers and businesses. I would wonder, would you think it's appropriate for Mexico to put tariffs on us because we're not doing enough to stop illegal guns and cash from going across the border?
I mean, that's a decision that Mexico has to make. I don't know how big a problem that is. It's just not something I study. I'm a trade person.
But you had an opinion about tariffs as it relates to a non-trade issue.
I have opinions about all kinds of things, and I try to keep them to myself. Hopefully,
well, it would be good because, you know, I'm afraid the president is at the point of, I'm going to call him tariff man. He thinks that tariffs are the end-all and be-all at the end of the day. And it's a dangerous economic game to play, especially when we're not talking about, trade-related issues. And I hope that internally you'll express that, because I know you don't want to express it here, but I could see the response. Let me ask you, do you think that this action with Mexico makes it more or less likely to get a comprehensive, lasting deal with China?
I think it makes it more likely.
More likely, okay. So how is it that you make a deal and then, like the USMCA, and then all of a sudden, for something that has absolutely nothing to do with trade, you get tariffs slapped on you? How does that make any potential trading partner more willing to engage with us if they don't understand actually what type of commitment we'll keep?
Well, in the first place, I think they do understand. In the second place, to the extent we end up with a secure border, that'll make our relationships between the United States and Mexico far better, more prosperous for both of us. I think that's what Mexico wants. I think that's what the United States wants.
It's not a question of borders. It's a question of China, Japan, India. You took them off the GPS list. I hope we can work to solve our issues with India so they can be reinstated into the GSP list. But you have to know that if I'm a trading partner, I want to have some predictability. And when I make a deal with you and then you start tariffs on me for something that has absolutely nothing to do with trade, then that is unpredictable.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador, thank you for being before us today. There's so many things to talk about. First, I appreciated the President's tweet about an hour ago where he talked about meeting with President Xi and the G20. And it seems to me he tasked you and your people to do some groundwork prior to that meeting that perhaps can result in getting the 301 negotiations back on track, which I think is very important. But USMCA is going to be my focus today because it's so crucial that we get this thing moving. And you've done a good job negotiating an agreement. It makes some necessary updates to the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. By the way, the thing is 25 years old. In the last quarter century, a lot has changed in our economy. A lot has changed in terms of our trading relationships. And I think for the most part, the agreement that you negotiated reflects that. And so, although I don't agree with every aspect of it, nor do you, because you had to negotiate it, it's a good agreement. On balance, it's going to be great for the people I represent in Ohio. Mexico's our #2 trading partner. Canada's #1. And so we very much want to have this agreement. The status quo is NAFTA. I mean, the alternative is, do we move forward with something that is better and improved, or do we stick with the status quo? The International Trade Commission has now said it'll create 176,000 jobs. It'll grow our economy. By the way, someone said, well, it's only going to grow the economy about 1/3 of a point. That's substantial, particularly in a state like mine, where these two countries are huge trading partners. And by the way, it's more than the projected GDP growth from the much-touted TPP agreement, as an example. So this is a big deal. And I think it's a high-quality 21st century agreement you brought home. Again, there's some things that you or I might have done a little differently, but that's not our choice. Our choice here is the status quo, which is NAFTA, or this new USMCA. Let me ask you a couple questions, if I might. A yes or no answer would suffice. Are labor and environmental commitments enforceable under the status quo, under NAFTA?
They are not.
Not, okay. Are they enforceable under the new USMCA?
They are enforceable.
They are enforceable. Okay, that's a big difference. How would you describe these new environmental and labor standards?
The environmental and labor standards are essentially non-existent in the current NAFTA, and they are quite robust, the most robust we've ever had in USMCA.
Most ever, any trade agreement we've ever done.
That's correct.
Let me ask you another question. Under the status quo, does the NAFTA contain any provisions related to digital trade or the internet?
No, there are no digital trade provisions in NAFTA.
None. None. Even though that's a big part of our trade today, does the USMCA, the new agreement, contain provisions related to digital trade and the internet?
It does, Senator. It has absolutely the gold standard. The best. I don't think there's anyone that could point to an agreement that's better than this with respect to digital trade.
Okay. How about expansion of agricultural products? Senator Cardin talked earlier about the opportunities for exporting more poultry. And I'm all for chickens. We also export them from Ohio. But how about beef, and how about pork, and how about commodities, wheat and corn, soybeans? Is it better for American farmers under the status quo NAFTA, or better under the USMCA, the new agreement?
No, the USMCA is substantially better. There are egg and poultry improvements. There are dairy improvements. There are wheat improvements. There are SPS improvements. There are a whole bunch of additional improvements.
Let's talk about auto jobs for a second. You come from Ohio originally. Auto jobs are really important to us, and #2 state in the country on auto and supplier and OEM jobs. In the past 25 years, under the status quo, have we lost or gained auto jobs to Mexico?
We've lost a substantial amount of our auto industry to Mexico.
Will the new USMCA lead to more automotive production and therefore more auto jobs in the United States of America?
Senator, it's our calculation that this agreement will lead to $33 billion in new investment over 5 years, $32 billion worth of annual parts and purchases in the United States, and over 80,000 new jobs just in the auto and auto parts sector.
Over 80,000 new jobs just in the auto sector. Okay, so our choice is the new USMCA, which may not be perfect for everybody, and sometimes around here we make the perfect the enemy of the good, and the status quo. The status quo is the current NAFTA. So Look, I hope you'll continue to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle on this. But I could go on and on, from the steel content and labor content in autos, the chapters on intellectual property you talked about, cracking down on state-owned enterprises, currency manipulation, something a lot of us have pushed you on, frankly, and Democrats have been more front and center on that, working with me on that over the years, and I appreciate that. But that's also unprecedented, right, in a trade agreement?
That's correct.
So there are a lot of things in here that, if you compare the status quo, which is NAFTA, to the USMCA, there are huge improvements. So I hope you continue to work with my colleagues who are undecided, because I think a lot of them are truly undecided. They're sincere about trying to get there and make this point that this is a choice we have to make here as a country. Do we want to move forward, or do we want to continue with the status quo that's not going to work for us? 25 years is a long time. Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you. Welcome, Ambassador. I'm going to ask you about an issue that we've talked about before, which is the problem of the massive international dumping of plastic waste into the world's oceans. As you know, we're headed for oceans that have more plastic than fish in them in the next few decades if we don't get ahead of this. It has really terrific bipartisan work happening in Congress as an issue. I want to commend particularly Senator Dan Sullivan, who's been the Republican leader on this, not only in the Senate, but also knocking on doors, including, I believe, yours in the administration, to say, hey, let's give this the attention it deserves. I see Senator Portman across the way, who's been an advocate in this area as well. When our bipartisan bill got signed into law, the president went on to some fulsome length about how important this is. As president, I'll continue everything I can to stop other nations from making our oceans into their landfills. It's a very unfair situation. It's also unbelievably bad for the oceans. All the time, we're being inundated by debris from other countries. Those are all remarks the president made at the signing ceremony. So here we have a big problem, great bipartisan work in Congress, a president who said, let's go, it seems, and then I read from Nairobi, from the Kenya conference, U.S. accused of blocking ambitious global action against plastic pollution. Then I went on a bipartisan codel to the Arctic and heard from governments in the Arctic that the U.S. is the slow dragger on their efforts to improve plastic and this problem, the Arctic being a particularly vulnerable ocean. Then I read from the G20, agreeing on a common approach to the problem has proved problematic, with the United States blocking demands to set a global target to significantly reduce or phase out single-use plastics. I asked Secretary Pompeo about this just recently, and he said, it was at a hearing right in this room, no, it was a different room, but a hearing of the Narcotics Caucus. This is important, he said, about getting the marine plastic debris problem solved. This is a priority. I hope my team's not dragging their feet. We ought not be doing that, and I will do more than discourage it if, in fact, I find that's the case. So I get these great statements from Trump administration leaders, including the president himself, about how this is a big priority. What more can I do to have this filter down to the people who are in the room in Nairobi, dealing with the Arctic nations and showing up at the G20, who are dragging on progress in the name of the United States? I'm at a loss as to where to go when we've got the Secretary of State and the President saying this is power forward on this issue, when I've got a Congress all around me that is saying this is important to us, this is bipartisan, and somewhere it all evaporates in these negotiations overseas. And where it comes into the USMCA is that it completely explodes the credibility of the language in the USMCA about a common effort with what the agreement calls marine litter, when behind the comments that I've seen publicly, there's such weak effort. We're the people that have to be dragged along instead of the ones who are leading. So what more can I do? I'm at a loss here.
So I would say, first of all, like Secretary Pompeo, I completely agree with you. I think that USMCA is the first agreement that really has this in it. I'll certainly ask Secretary Pompeo. I wasn't in the room in any of Nairobi. I've never been to Nairobi. But I am very concerned about this issue. That's one of the reasons that it's in there. And I think there are other things that can be done outside of the realm of these international obligations more in a unilateral way. And I would like to sit down and talk to you and Senator Sullivan about it. I think I am very focused on this. I think it is a travesty, and it only comes from a few places, or at least if you took care of it in a few places.
5 countries and 9 rivers.
Yeah, the whole problem notionally goes away certainly if you take care of 8 or 9 rivers, and I think that we ought to be thinking about whether or not there's some more novel trade remedy that we ought to at least try. And I've been trying to cook one up, and when it's to the point where it's only slightly underdone,
Well,
I want to sit
my
down
time
with
has
you
expired. Let's continue the conversation. I know you've asked for a meeting. I've said yes. We'll schedule that. We'll see what we can do. It's intensely frustrating in our very politically divided country when we produce the kind of bipartisanship we've produced, bicameral bipartisanship that we've produced on cleaning up this mess, when we have the kind of positive statements we have out of the President, out of the Secretary of State, and now out of the Trade Representative, and at the same time, every time this issue turns up, we are the ones who the rest of the world sees as dragging against progress instead of leading progress. So thank you.
Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. Mr. Ambassador, good to see you and great to have you here. Thanks for the hard work you're doing and for staying in touch with us. You won't be surprised that I'm going to be raising the issue of enforcement, and I know you spoke to that both in your testimony and I'm sure otherwise today. I wanted to start, though, with a reiteration of my support for the labor and cooperation enforcement framework that 2 of our colleagues proposed, Senator Wyden and Senator Brown, Senator Wyden being the ranking member of the committee. Just by way of quick summary, increasing the number of and training of enforcement personnel. Number 2, U.S.-provided capacity building and joint initiatives to promote the enforcement of internationally recognized labor rights, and also working together to audit and inspect facilities. All of that, which I know you're aware of, just wanted to put that on the record just for emphasis. I'll start today, Mr. Ambassador, with an acronym and a description. The acronym is ILAB, known as the Bureau of International Labor Affairs in our Department of Labor. Here's what their website says in terms of the mission of this bureau. In the general description of their work, they say, and I'm quoting, ILAB's mission is to promote a fair global playing field for workers in the United States and around the world by enforcing trade commitments, strengthening labor standards, and then it goes on from there. Then there's a section entitled Our Role. It says ILAB promotes a strong U.S. trade policy by, the second bullet under that on the website is, quote, enforcing the labor provisions of U.S. free trade agreements and trade preference programs. I mention that because last year, meaning the fiscal year 2019 budget, that bureau had a budget of $86.1 million in funding. The President's budget proposal asked for only $18.5 million. Even I can do the math. That's a $68 million cut, a 78 percentage point cut. And I know you care about these issues. I know you care about enforcement. But when you see that kind of a cut based upon the mission and the work of that bureau, how can workers in my home state of Pennsylvania or any other state trust the administration is serious about labor enforcement when the President's budget cuts that bureau by 78% just from one year to the next?
Well, it won't surprise you, but you know that I don't know much about the Department of Labor's budget. Though I have been in rooms where this particular issue was raised on a few occasions. And I guess the first thing I would say is that, as I understand it, the same thing was true last year, and the Congress put the money back in, and that's why you have the $86 billion. And I can't second-guess the budget. I don't think about how they put budgets together. One of the nice things about USTR is our budget is so small, substantially smaller than ILAB's budget for my entire operation. but that's probably another issue. It is my commitment and the President's commitment that we're going to enforce the labor provisions in this agreement and all the other agreements, but in this agreement specifically, and I think we'll come to a way that we can do that by working with members and compromising on both sides. The actual budget of ILAB, I just don't know much about it.
And I take at your word. I would ask two things. One is that you raise this with the administration, that it's important that if they're going to talk about enforcement administration-wide, that they got to have the numbers that in the budgetary support for that, because dollars matter. I know a good bit about government at both the state and federal level. Dollars matter when it comes to enforcement. And secondly, that you would make sure that this becomes a major issue, not just in the context of this budget, in this particular department, but also to keep pushing forward with the proposal that Senator Wyden and Senator Brown, and I know you have considered that seriously. Just a last question. Maybe I'll also submit it for the record so you can answer it more fully. But I did want to ask you a question, and I will submit it in writing just to give you a preview of the engagement that you've undertaken in the context of China and 301 with regard to our European allies and other allies, where we can build kind of a strategic partnership in the context of the 301 investigation. I wanted to get your kind of a summary of what you've been doing on that, because I think one of the problems we're having now is it doesn't seem like we've got a multi-nation or multi-state strategy. But I'll leave that for days when I have more time, and I'll submit it in writing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cassidy.
Ambassador Lighthizer, thank you again. You have made yourself so available. We've talked about the ISDS, or the investor-state dispute system, under a previous phone call. And I thank you for that, and I look forward to kind of pursuing that with you. You've made your views clear. I do want to ask one point of clarity. I've heard two different things. I've heard that if you contract with the Mexican government, you do have access to ISDS. I've also heard that if you contract with the state-owned enterprise of Mexico, you have access to ISDS. Which of those is it?
The answer is the SOE issue.
I don't think your microphone's on.
If the SOE is acting as an instrumentality of the government, then you would have ISDS. If it's not acting as an instrumentality of the government, then you would not. Then you would have what was otherwise worked out. That is to say, if there's an actual expropriation, if there's a denial of MFN or a denial of national treatment, you would still have that access, but you would not have the old ISDS in that case, unless the state-owned enterprise was acting as in the place of the government.
Got it. And I assume that there's some way to differentiate that the contractual language would indicate that, because it seems like it could be nebulous.
Well, some of these things, I suspect, will be resolved through litigation, right? I mean, that tends to be what happens in these narrow cases.
Okay. Fertilizer, EU has duties on our fertilizer. We kind of let them come into the degree that they produce them, we let them come into our country pretty freely. One of my constituents recently submitted a 301 public comment requesting that nitrogen fertilizers be added to the list of EU imports subject to retaliatory duties. And I'm told they impose a duty of 6.5% on our nitrogen fertilizers. They recently imposed an anti-dumping duty on imports of urea ammonium nitrate fertilizer, making the total import duty level of over 29%, obviously prohibitive, or you can imagine prohibitive for U.S. urea nitrogen nitrate exports. Any thoughts on that?
First of all, when an anti-dumping case is brought, I mean, we'll challenge that at the WTO if we don't think it was, if it was properly brought or they didn't follow the international norms or their commitments. The issue of whether we can add to the list of items that we're going to retaliate on the Airbus case is something that's under consideration. We've had hearings on that. We can't make a decision on that until we get a decision from the arbitrator of what the amount is. But I am aware of your interest in this area, and doing something in the area of fertilizer is certainly something that we'll consider. But it'll determine, one, on the extent to which we can retaliate, and that's up to an arbitrator at this point, and then two, when we take the action. But it is one of there are a bunch of things under consideration, and certainly this is one of them, Senator.
Thank you. Lastly, I want to bring up counterfeits, which, according to your office, imports of counterfeit and pirated products were valued at approximately $500 billion, or 2.5% of imports around the globe. And many are sold online from seemingly reputable and well-rated third-party vendors, sold on well-known online sites. And yet, although difficult to be spotted, can likewise have a lot of, aside from lost revenue for the company who owns the patent or intellectual property, there's other problems, for example, such as chemical burns, lead poisoning, breaking of products and children swallowing them, etc. Knowing that you've taken an interest in this, can you kind of give us an update on what your efforts and policies have been regarding anti-counterfeiting?
It is a huge problem, and I suspect that if we actually had better inspections, the number would be far bigger than even your figures indicate. Because when you see the few times when they have actually done studies of this, where they've kind of taken products apart during a brief period of time and saw what was in it, the issues, the numbers are generally higher than that. And what we have in our arsenal, one is we have a notorious markets list, which we put out, but it's more in the nature of public shaming than it is anything else. Two, we have Special 301, where we can take actions against countries. But certainly, any time you can see a pattern in this area from a country that we can prove, we're interested to try any kind of a novel idea. It's a huge problem. The administration, I should say, also is looking at not necessarily just my office, but looking at some other things like the postal regs and the like, to see if there are ways we can actually start doing a better job of this. And it is, I would say also, in the USMCA, we have substantial improvements in this USMCA. And for someone who really cares about counterfeiting, this is even another reason to bring it. We have what's called ex officio authority given, which means that the Canadians and the Mexicans would then be required to stop the counterfeits that come in, often from China, for example, in through them. So we have a very robust provision in this area in USMCA.
In my conversation with the Mexicans, they also like that provision. I yield back. Thank you.
Senator Lankford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Bob, it's good to see you again. Thanks for the ongoing work. There's a great deal that needs to be done on USMCA. This is a situation where we have NAFTA and we have USMCA. Those are the two options sitting in front of us. And we've got to be able to determine which one's the better option on it. From every appearance that I have and what I've seen, the USMCA is a much better deal than what we have currently with NAFTA, but looking forward to the ongoing conversation about this. Help me understand one section of it. What do you see on the future of autos? I know there's been a lot of focus on trying to get auto manufacturing in North America, but I want to focus specifically on what the effect will be of the USMCA on auto exports outside of North America for parts, supplies, materials, finished products that we produce in North America and then ship in different countries that pick up. What do you think happens in that based on this agreement?
So I would say, first of all, thank you for your comments. Secondly, I think the auto sector is among the biggest beneficiaries of this agreement. And by the way, it's one of the ones who have lost the most because of NAFTA. So this is just a huge, people who care about autos and auto parts, this is a huge improvement. This agreement, in and of itself, will make it easier to export to Mexico and to Canada. The reality is we don't export a huge amount to Mexico. We do export some.
But I'm thinking about exports outside of North America.
Outside of North America, the way it will principally affect is you are seeing substantial new investment in North America in a whole variety of states, some in the northern tier, but a lot of it in in the southern tier of the countries, all of those plants that will be meeting the new NAFTA requirements, that is to say have higher U.S. content and more production in the United States, all of those plants will be able to export more easily just through their own efficiency. And I'll give you an example of that. BMW is one. BMW is one of the biggest, forget auto, one of the biggest net exporters in the United States is BMW. And they are substantially increasing their plant for a lot of reasons of efficiency. And that will make them even a bigger exporter of automobiles.
So let me ask this, because NAFTA has worked pretty well on ag in particular, what does USMCA benefit the ag community on that's different than NAFTA? It's a greater benefit. Just give me one or two examples.
So, well, I mean, one would be in the wheat area. We corrected the bad wheat labeling there. Number two, they have up in Canada what's called Class 7 and Class 6, which are limitations on our exports. They've had a devastating effect on our dairy provisions. And I would say, if you said what was I most lobbied on by members before we fixed it, I would say it was the way they treat our dairy. I mean, I had senators from all across the country, very, very concerned about that. So there's wheat, there's dairy.
Both those are Canada related.
Pardon me?
Both those are Canada related, the wheat and dairy.
Yeah, yes.
Right.
They're both Canada. There also are, these are the best provisions on SPS. We have a provision that solves a discriminatory action against U.S. wine. We have limitations on how these geographic indications are used against the United States. There are rules for the first time really on biologics and biotechnology and approving new biotechnology. I mean, it is a remarkably better agreement, and I should say that's even given the fact that agriculture did relatively well under the old NAFTA.
So let me ask you one more question on USMCA, but before I run out of time, I want to mention to you again how important the 301 exclusion process is to me. And I know you're working on this, and we talk about it often, but for those that have been through List 1 and 2, their exclusions are coming up. I would hope that there would be a way to be able to rapidly renew those exclusions that they already have from List 1 and 2, and for List 3 that's happening to get through the exclusion process rapidly, which, again, the first round in going through it with List 1 and 2 took 8-10 months on some products. This is a much larger list for List 3, and I just hope that they can. You and I have talked about it before, and we can go from there. Let me ask you about the digital trade provisions, though, in the USMCA. What is the digital trade provisions? Are they similar to what we're seeing in the Pacific Rim and the TPP? And what they're already putting into place, protecting customs duties on electronic products, source code protections and such, those similar to the TPP provisions of what we're putting in the USMCA just for digital trade?
So I would say in every respect they are plussed up over TPP. They are a better agreement than TPP. Obviously, there are no agreements in NAFTA, so we can forget about that. But under TPP, we plussed them up in every case, and the reason we could do that in reality was because we had the benefit of TPP. So we knew what was in there, and we plussed it up and used the leverage of these negotiations to get better agreements. So source codes for sure, data flow, data localization, all of these provisions. And Senator Wyden is like the world's leading expert on this, and he's going to endorse my comment. This is better than TPP in all of these respects.
Senator Daines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lighthizer, good to have you here today. I want to tell you I very much appreciate your leadership, the President's leadership on China and holding them accountable. I also want to thank you for your efforts to modernize and improve our trade agreements. As you know, our number one economic driver in Montana is agriculture. Opening these new markets for Montana agriculture, also energy, including coal exports, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, as well as our outdoor economy are absolutely essential for our jobs and our state's economy. And advancing USMCA is critically important, and it needs to get done this year. But we aren't operating in a vacuum, and we're losing ground against many of our competitors in critical markets like Japan. So I want to pivot over and talk about Japan here for a moment and ask some questions on it. You've previously highlighted your goal of quickly reaching an agreement with Japan. potentially in a two-stage process. The question is, where do negotiations stand, and what timeline are you looking at for a possible agreement with Japan?
So thank you, Senator. First of all, for your comments on the importance of USMCA. And secondly, with respect to Japan, one of the biggest beneficiaries of our actions with Japan will be, of course, the beef industry, but also pork and some others. And they're also the ones that are most at risk if we don't do something because of the fact that Japan has entered into agreements with TPP.
We have about 3 cows per person in Montana, so that's music to my ears.
Right.
We'd like to ship more of them over to Japan.
We want to get more of them to Japan. So we have had a series of negotiations, including at the staff level and at my level last week. We are going to meet again during the course of the G20 on the side of the G20. I'll talk to you privately about what people or who said what to whom so that you have full information. I won't say it here publicly. But I think that we are making headway. And we're in a situation where if we don't make headway quickly, people will lose customers and never get that market share back. So it's a serious thing that the Japanese are fully engaged. They understand what needs to be done. We've been quite clear about it. And my hope is that we're just, in the next few months, we'll have agreement on that.
Thank you. And you're exactly right. Our ag folks particularly are concerned about losing share in this kind of zero-sum game. A follow-up on that, do you intend to pursue negotiation with Japan consistent with TPA authority that we'd have a congressional approval as part of that process?
So what I have proposed doing is to try to take care of a couple of the issues, particularly agriculture, early, because if we don't, we don't want to wait the length of time for an entire negotiation. Beyond that, we want to negotiate across the board with the Japanese.
So regarding Japan and coal exports, Japan has expressed strong interest in more U.S. coal. In fact, according to the World Energy Outlook, Japan and Korea will remain 100% reliant on foreign coal imports until 2040. Now, a lot of their coal is coming from the south, Australia, Indonesia. It comes to the South China Sea. And I can tell you the Japanese have voiced their concerns directly to me about the fact the coal is coming through the South China Sea, the concerns about the militarization of the South China Sea. We have very clear shipping lanes from our west coast over to Japan. They want more Montana coal. They want more Powder River Basin coal. That's very good for our state. It's very good for jobs. It's very good for Montana's Crow tribe, as well as overall energy security. However, our current export capabilities are at capacity, and we're struggling to get more out due to Washington states. The state of Washington is extreme in job-killing permitting processes. My question is this: as negotiations with Japan are ongoing, could you commit to ensure that coal and other U.S. energy exports are on the table, and to work to increase coal and energy exports to the Asia-Pacific region?
Yes, I certainly will, and not just in the negotiations. I'll raise it personally with my counterpart, but as you know, the president focuses a lot on coal sales, and a lot of other sales too. Yeah. But I will certainly remind the president about this as we head over.
Thank you. One quick question on polysilicon. The U.S. polysilicon industry has been targeted by China, and these retaliatory tariffs are threatening manufacturing jobs at REC Silicon in Butte, Montana. Ambassador Lighthizer, is removing these tariffs on U.S. polysilicon a priority, and will you work to address them as these negotiations with China continue?
Yes, it is something we've raised on numerous occasions. We'll continue to raise. You know the background of it. There's what we think of as an unfair kind of retaliatory anti-dumping case was brought against those products by the Chinese. It is something that we have raised and will continue to raise. And if we find ourselves with an agreement, then we would expect this to be part of it.
Thanks.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's good to see you. Thank you for being here. Let me just echo the comments of my Democratic colleagues when it comes to the USMCA. We want to work with you. We want to get to a positive outcome. but clearly more work needs to be done, as we've discussed here today. And it seems to me that both parties in both chambers very much want to reach this deal. I hope that you and the administration will work to incorporate the Brown-Wyden labor enforcement proposals and other changes to make the agreement as good as it needs to be for the American workers and to ensure it gets broad bipartisan support.
I mean, I'm not endorsing any proposal specifically, but I will certainly work with Senator Wyden and Senator Brown and other members who have a particular interest in this area and have every expectation that we'll come to a conclusion that'll be satisfactory to you, Senator. And
I appreciate that. Let me jump to trade with China. Outdoor recreation is a critical part of Nevada's economy, supporting 87,000 direct jobs. It generates $12.6 billion in consumer spending and $4 billion in wages and salaries and $1.1 billion in state and local tax revenue. Many of the outdoor products used by Nevadans and outdoor enthusiasts have been hit by tariffs if they are sourced from China, such as backpacks, sports bags, leather ski gloves, camp chairs, camp stoves, and bikes. The next round will deal another blow to the outdoor recreation economy, targeting apparel, footwear, tents, sleeping bags, skis, snowboards, and other sporting goods. These products have already faced import tariffs on average of about 14% and as high as almost 40%. Additional tariffs significantly raise the cost for outdoor companies and consumers, putting jobs and new outdoor gear at risk and impeding the ability of more Americans to enjoy the great outdoors. Ambassador, what is your assessment of the impact of the China 301 tariffs on companies whose products already face significant import tariffs, and what opportunities do these companies have to seek relief? And what opportunities do these companies have to seek relief?
First of all, we have, as you know, several tranches. The last tranche is the biggest tranche. My guess is that that's where most of the outdoor recreation equipment is, and we have hearings going on that started yesterday, and they go all over. There are 7 days of hearings. They finish next Tuesday. So when you say what opportunities they have, I'm sure they're testifying and sending in statements and trying to make their case as well as they can on the impact. And number one, there's been no decision made as to whether to put tariffs in place. And with respect to that last tranche, the president will make that decision at some point in the next few weeks, and I can't, of course, prejudge that. I would say in every case we've tried to figure out ways to minimize the effect in the U.S. and I think part of it is the exclusion process that Senator Langford talked about. But there's a lot of other things that we're trying to do to try to make this as painless. But it is, in the final analysis, painful, and you have to start with the proposition that what we are facing with China is worth having some discomfort in the U.S. side of it.
So what do I tell these companies?
I'm sorry.
What do I tell these companies?
Well, I mean, hopefully they're making compelling arguments. Number one. Number two, there is an exclusion process where presumably they go through the same sort of thing and they'd make their kinds of arguments. And that is looked at by our professional staff, and we have, I think, been fair in terms of granting exclusions in situations.
And I appreciate that, but my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tranche 4 included billions of dollars of goods that had been removed from earlier tranches following comment and testimony by the public and detailed analysis by your staff. So companies who won these removals now are having to file comments all over again. So, and that's why I'm getting the questions from the companies. Is at what time does it stop? What type of relief do they have? Is this something that's going to just continue on a whim? What type of policy should they be looking toward with respect to their companies?
So we are involved in a very difficult trade struggle, which I think is extremely important to the U.S. economy, and that is whether or not we're going to protect our intellectual property and the jobs of the future, and even our current jobs. And it's impossible to predict when that will be resolved, but I think it is such an important issue. It's one that not only do we have to engage in, but should have been engaged in for decades before. And it was to the shame of all the people who had who had these kinds of jobs, and I would say members as well as us, that we have not focused on this issue enough. And there are issues that will come up with it, and we're trying to make it as small as possible. What we've seen in many cases is people moving the manufacture of these jobs of these products out of China, in which case there is no problem. Another option, of course, is to move the manufacture of these products to the United States, in which case there are no tariffs and no threat of tariffs. So I would say in the long term, if I was in this business, I can't predict what the United States is going to do or whether we're going to be able to resolve this issue with China. My hope is that we can. But if we can't, if I were in that industry, I would decide on other options down the road and hopefully including bringing some of the production back to the United States.
Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, we've had many conversations about these subjects in the past, but I would reiterate what my colleague just said about an exclusion process that actually is workable and usable for some of these companies. We have companies in my state of South Dakota, I think you're probably familiar with Polaris, that are just getting hammered, that don't have opportunities to shift supply chains and are paying a dear price in the form of impact not only in their business, but I think long-term on their future and the future for their employees. So this has got to, having an exclusion process in place that is a usable for these manufacturers who are being harmed, and in some cases harmed greatly, needs to be addressed. And there are so many of these unintended consequences, I think, of some of the trade policies that are in place right now. I mean, I was in a small town in South Dakota on a main street, stopped into a meat locker, and the guy says, yeah, you need to get this deal with China fixed. He said, I used to have somebody that would pay me $150 a hide to haul my hides away. He said China was buying them. There was a demand for them. Now he says I have to pay $600 to have somebody haul them away because that market closed off. And he said it's costing my business $40,000 a year, which in his business is probably the margin. So they're just I just would convey to you the sense of urgency associated with, at least as we continue this fight with China, putting in place a process that would be usable, navigatable for our companies. Let me just ask, too, because I know you've answered this question probably at some length from some of my colleagues, but on this issue of submitting the implementing legislation, I know that you're working with the House leadership to try and come up with something that would be, in the end, something they could agree to and that would be passable. But at what point, if you can't reach that deal, might you submit implementing legislation so we can at least get the clock moving? I mean, I assume you're in those negotiations. Hopefully they're making progress, but I'm concerned, and I think a lot of us are, that if we don't start making some headway on this deal, that we could end up getting into the fall or into next year where it gets increasingly complicated, I think, by election year politics.
Well, thank you, Senator. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, number one, we have a process that's ongoing, and I think we are making progress. And it is certainly my hope, as I've said, many times since the very beginning of this, that this has been negotiated in a bipartisan way. Many members have many provisions in here that we've adopted that are in this agreement one way or another. So there are members that have a major stake in it on the Democratic as well as the Republican side. The Speaker has put in place a process that we're working our way through. We certainly agree with you that we want this to be dealt with as soon as possible. The benefits of the agreement are being delayed by delaying on this, and you're also putting in place this risk of, I call it sort of the accidental cause. If something happens that has nothing to do with anything anybody's contemplating, and it has some impact on the passage of this, because this is really important to millions and millions of Americans' jobs. It's not just a small FTA with some country that people have never been to. This is $1.4 trillion worth of trade. So in terms of the deadline, I don't want to send the deadline. There clearly is an urgency, which I completely share with you, that we have to get this done. And I would say I see no reason to believe that most of the people I'm dealing with sense the same urgency. They want to get it done. It's been around for a while. It was negotiated 9 months ago. People have had access to it for 9 months. And so it's important that we do it quickly.
Good. And just to again, one of the big concerns I would tell you from farmers in my state is that we risk permanently losing market share if we don't get some of these deals done. And I'm speaking not just of Canada and Mexico, but of course China. And I know that you have indicated that you're working on other bilateral deals. I would urge you to continue to push hard to get a deal with Japan. That's a huge market for South Dakota agriculture. But I think that if we don't, there are other countries that are going to leapfrog the United States in building these free trade networks, and our producers in my state and across the country are going to continue to lose market share. So I know my time's expired, but please keep working urgently to get these deals done.
I think if we can get the last three in, we can get everybody accommodated before the vote ends. So, Senator Carper.
Thanks. And Ambassador Lighthizer, welcome. Thank you, you and your team, for working so hard on this agreement. And I think there's a lot of eagerness on our side to work with you to improve the renegotiated NAFTA agreement. Try to get to yes. There are a couple of areas where we still have some work to do. We talked about some of those today, and I want to mention them as well. I'm the ranking member of the Environment and Public Works Committee in the United States Senate. And as a result, the environmental chapter, as you might imagine, is of special interest to me and to my colleagues on that committee. I want to thank you for the outcomes in the environment chapter that are an improvement over the current NAFTA. I'll mention a couple of them, including the obligation to eliminate fishing subsidies and also the cooperation framework between the countries in the new agreement we believe is also improved. Of course, the goals of these obligations aren't going to be met without sufficient monitoring, cooperation, and resources. We don't want enforcement of the environmental obligations to get short shrift. I suspect you don't either. I don't normally ask yes or no questions. We're going to ask two of them, and you don't have to do much more than say yes or no. So here we go. Will you pledge to work with this committee with me to identify where there may be gaps in the resources that are currently available for monitoring and enforcement of the environmental obligations?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. And also, would you pledge to work with us to determine ways in which domestic stakeholders can be partners with the government to monitor what's happening on the ground and to ensure enforcement of the obligations in the environmental chapter?
Yes.
Thanks so much. My second question revolves around USMCA dispute settlement. The state-to-state dispute settlement system in the new NAFTA continues to allow for panel blocking. That's, as I understand it, the main reason a dispute settlement panel hasn't been established since maybe the early 2000s. The Trans-Pacific Partnership made changes, I believe, to fix panel blocking, but these improvements were not included in the new NAFTA. From the statement of administrative action, the administration said to Congress, it appears that the White House plans to use Section 301 tariffs to unilaterally enforce USMCA provisions when a dispute occurs. I would just ask if you could explain to us briefly why using Section 301, which would very likely invite retaliation from Canada and Mexico, is preferable to a binding dispute system that does not allow panel blocking.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you, Senator. First of all, I would point out the obvious, and that is that panel blocking is permitted under the current NAFTA as well as under USMCA. So anyone objectively looking at distinguishing between the two and deciding to vote against the second because of there's an improvement in the first couldn't find that. So what we did is we kept the current provision. Now, why did we keep? Let me say first of all, you're right about there hasn't been any in a while in this context. The reason for that is people have tended to go to the WTO to enforce those rights, and there's been a number of WTO cases. So second, why did we not make that change? Our view is that we could enforce our laws in the rare circumstance where there was a blockage by using our unilateral law under 301. 301 says you should go to the international organization or the agreement for enforcement if there is a violation of a trade agreement or the WTO in this case. If the other side blocks the position you would take is that thus you've exhausted your remedies and therefore you could legally use 301. So that's like the nature of it. And why did we do that? Number one, we think it will be very rarely used, but in a situation where, for example, someone challenged the trade laws of the United States and made some argument about that, about the viability of the trade laws, you'd want to be in a position where you could preserve your rights. But this is something I'm perfectly happy to work with members on and see where members draw their line. It was clearly a U.S. ask. It wasn't an ask from the other side. The other side was, since they had signed up from TPP, presumably would be willing to go along with it.
All right, and with respect to China tariffs, we've heard, I suspect all of us on this committee have heard from constituent companies in our own states who spent a fair amount of time and money trying to navigate the process for securing a product exclusion from the president's tariffs. And members of this committee have tried repeatedly to get answers from your staff on how USTR defines, prioritizes, and weighs the criteria for obtaining a product exclusion, but haven't received answers that are deemed to be satisfactory. I just want to ask if you would commit force today to consulting closely with this committee, its members, including my office, as USTR develops its process for excluding products from the $200 billion List 3 tariffs. In particular, I want to make sure that the USTR is transparent in how it defines, how it prioritizes, how it weighs the criteria for getting product exclusion, especially since, unlike earlier lists, very few, if any, products on List 3 are related to made in China.
Senator Brown.
Could you say yes or no? That was a good answer. Thank you.
Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to focus, thank you, Ambassador, good to see you again. I want to focus my questions on China, but I want to make one comment on NAFTA. I've said it before, I'll say it again, publicly, privately to you. I want to get to yes, but it has to be good for American workers. We can't just change the name of an agreement and expect it to stop jobs leaving Ashtabula and Mansfield and the industrial Midwest and going to Mexico. We need to make sure the agreement has strong anti-outsourcing provisions, that they're enforced better than before. Ranking Member Wyden and I have an enforcement proposal many of you on this committee have mentioned that will do that. I look forward to working with you to get it incorporated. I know you said to Ranking Member Wyden that you would do whatever it takes, and that's good to hear. Thank you for that. China, I want to turn to China. I've been concerned about China's unfair trade practices for, frankly, 20 years as a member of the House and Senate. We know the way China cheats. Huge subsidies, state-owned companies don't act like companies at all. Their industrial policies urge global domination. Their workers can't join independent unions to fight for higher wages. We know that the costs our economy suffered. We know how many jobs have been lost in Ohio, the industrial Midwest, and all over the country. Our manufacturers have closed or struggled to compete. So I'm supportive of any and all efforts to get tough on China, but we need to see results, and I'm worried we don't have a plan B. So my questions, if you can get as close as possible because of the crunch of time, Mr. Ambassador, yes or no on these. China's steel state-owned enterprises account for 8 of the 10 biggest steel producers in that country, are a big part of the steel overcapacity problems. If the talks with China don't succeed, do you think tariffs by themselves will force these SOEs to stop cheating?
You know I can't answer that yes or no. So can I give a regular answer? Or do you want me to?
Sure.
I could pass if you prefer. And given the shortness of time, I'm prepared to pass. I don't know if it'll get them to stop cheating tariffs alone. I think you don't have any other option. I know one thing that won't work, and that is talking to them, because we've done that for 20 years, and I know you agree with me on that. So if we don't get an agreement, and then we have to do something. And if there's a better idea than tariffs, I'd like to hear it. I haven't heard it. But I do know that you and I agree that just chatting with them in a dialogue is not going to get them to change, because that's been proven to be unsuccessful.
I know you care about that. I know you care about wages, Chinese wages for Chinese workers, and the impact that has both on their country and what it has on our competitiveness with them. But I'm just concerned that there is no plan B. Has the president really established a strong coalition of other countries that will work with us to force China to stop cheating if our bilateral efforts fail? Have we done that?
Of course we have. We have a coalition. We have a coalition which is the United States. It's called the Trilateral Group, and we had not the Trilateral Commission, we call it Trilateral Group, and it's the United States, Europe, and Japan, and we have met a number of times to deal with exactly this issue. And we've put out statements. We've had eight meetings We'll continue to have more. I think it's been very effective. So the criticism that we haven't put together a group is an erroneous criticism.
Well, it didn't exactly start out that way, but I don't want to
I'm happy
argue.
to say we had our first meeting on, do you remember when our first meeting was? It was at least 2 years ago. Yeah, I think it was just short of 2 years ago. So we've been doing it for some time. It is something that we've given an enormous amount of effort to, and our last meeting was within the last 3 weeks.
I mean, I think that the criticism of this is, by many, is that we don't play well with others when the others, I'm not counting others as North Korea and Russia and Orban and Duterte, we don't play well with others in terms of our allies, our economic and our democratic allies in our efforts. So I guess I'm looking for, if this doesn't work, if this agreement, what is the plan B? Understand talking alone doesn't do it, but I'm very concerned that there's no long-term relief in sight for Ohioans wondering whether they'll get to compete on a level playing field with China. So I ask you to consider that.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I also have to say that to suggest that the only difference between NAFTA and USMCA is name change, I would take strong exception to that. But I guess you're aware of that too, since you said that in your initial thing. I just don't want to let that pass.
Well, I understand, but I understand there are differences. I didn't say the name change is the only difference, but I'm saying a repackage is not nearly sufficient on issues that Senator Stabenow talked about, on access to medicines, on 5 or 6 of my colleagues talked about Brown-Wyden. Those are essential to stop jobs from leaving our communities and going to Mexico.
Well, sufficiency is a judgment that only a senator can make. I can't, but I would say it's massively different in roles of origin for automobiles, massively different in labor, massively different in currency, massively different in intellectual property. Digital trade doesn't even compare. Financial services. We have a sunset, which you're very much aware of, modified, not exactly what you and I wanted, but a lot better than we've ever had in any other agreement. It's got SOE deals. It's got at least 20 provisions that we count that have an enormous amount of cooperation with my friend from Ohio.
Senator Asser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for keeping the hearing going. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here. I'll just start by echoing what you've heard from other colleagues. I'm encouraged by the USMCA working groups that Speaker Pelosi has set up in the House. Many of my colleagues and I are encouraged by aspects of the agreement, but we need to find ways to improve the impact that the agreement would have on American workers and businesses. So I am hopeful that the process operating in the House will help us get there. I wanted to turn now to China as well. I visited China at the end of April as part of a CODEL with Senator Coons. While I was there, it seemed that both parties wanted a deal. Soon after I returned, the talks broke down. It was good to see an announcement this morning that President Trump and President Xi are in fact going to meet at the G20 in Japan later this month. What I would like to make sure is that we can have at both a member level and a staff level a full briefing after that happens. I very much appreciated you coming to my office when I first became a member of the Finance Committee, but it would be very helpful to have more regular staff-to-staff briefings as well. Can you commit to that?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. But I would say if you want actual candor, it'll have to be member to Lighthizer.
That's fair enough. I'm happy to do that, too.
Which I'm prepared to do.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I would like to turn as well to the exclusion process that we've been talking about for the third list of Chinese goods subject to Section 301 tariffs. I've heard from companies like one called Nemo in Dover, New Hampshire, who are trying to make decisions that impact their growth, such as whether they'll have the revenue to make new hires or not. And in order to make these decisions, they need to have answers on whether their products will be granted an exclusion. In the interim, they are being subjected to 25% tariff on a line of products that represents 10% of their overall businesses. So do you have an understanding of the timeline for when the third list, the exclusion process for the third list will be fully functional?
So yes, Senator, and this is something that I would suggest that your staff do call my staff with respect to this company. for sure. But it's been a major process, as you can imagine. We do have experience, having done it on the first couple of tranches. The form that you can actually fill out is available, and it's online.
And this is a company that has written to you. It has. I'm sure it's doing its process. But I just want to be clear, because I think the businesses and the constituents that we all represent need us to say this. I understand that you're taking a big picture look at this and saying that I think the word you used earlier today was some discomfort may be necessary. For Nemo equipment to reinvent their supply lines will take 2 years. It's a 25-person company that was just about to launch a whole new sector of growth. And the instability of the tariffs themselves, as well as the lack of certainty and predictability, is really holding them back at this point and harming them, and may in fact mean not only that they can't grow, but that they may have to lay people off. So I understand what you're trying to balance here, but we need predictability. We will follow up with your staff, but there's been plenty of time to get this exclusion process in place, and it is really urgent that it be operating transparently and predictably. Is that fair?
That is a fair comment.
All right, thank you. Now let me just, because we have a vote, one of the most commonly relayed messages from my businesses in New Hampshire too is again the need for predictability and certainty. The manner in which the China negotiations have been starting, stopping, restarted by tweet, etc., has left businesses really guessing about what the administration will do next. Just last month, the president threatened to impose another round, list 4, of tariffs on China. This set would encompass virtually all goods coming into the United States from China. Businesses are nervous. These tariffs would directly impact the prices everyday Americans spend on the things that they need. I know that the USTR began a hearing about this list yesterday, and you said today you won't comment on the status of those tariffs and the likelihood that the president implements them. But can you tell me that if he does announce tariffs for this list 4, that there will be an exclusion process?
Yes.
And can you tell us what the cost of these tariffs would be on middle-class Americans?
I don't even know if we're going to have the tariffs. It's entirely up to the president.
Well, just for the record here, it's going to cost middle-class Americans a lot in their quality of life and in their financial health. And so I hope that you and the administration and our president are taking that into account. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer, your willingness to appear. I hope you consider your obligation to appear. You have a lot on your plate, and we know that you work hard at your job. I would request that senators with questions for the record please submit them by the close of business, July 2. Meeting adjourned. Thank you for coming.